The gospel lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, the 13th chapter. Let us stand together in honor of the reading of the gospel. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. They will all be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. But this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The Revised Common Lectionary dictates that the scripture lessons for today come from 1 Samuel, Hebrews, and Mark. But I would like to add another text, a non-canonical one. J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Besides being one of the greatest works of imagination in the history of English literature, Tolkien's trilogy is also a profound treatment of the nature of evil and power. A brilliant medievalist and an Oxford Don, Tolkien was also a Christian who understood at a deep level the truth of Lord Acton's dictum, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." If you're not familiar with the story, and it sounds like some of you are, the title Lord of the Rings refers to Sauron, the Dark Lord of Mordor, who in ages past forged a ring of power to help him overrun Middle-earth and establish world domination. He lost the ring long ago, and he wants it back. As the wizard Gandalf explains to the hobbit Frodo Baggins, the enemy still lacks one thing to give him the strength and knowledge to beat down all resistance, to break the last defenses, and to cover all the lands in a second darkness. He lacks the one ring. This ring the Dark Lord had forged to gain control of the other rings of power. Gandalf says, "He made that ring himself, it is his. And he let a great part of his former power pass into it, so that he could rule all the others." By a series of misfortunes, tragedies, and unlikely occurrences, the ring has come into the hands of Frodo. When Gandalf finally discovers that Frodo's ring is in fact the One Ring, Sauron's ring, a council of allies meets to decide what they're to do next. It has become clear that the Dark Lord, once thought vanquished, has regrouped and returned to power in the shadowy land of Mordor. He has begun assembling a great army to assault the free peoples of Middle-earth, and having learned that the One Ring still exists, has mounted a concerted effort to find it and recover it. Gandalf says he is seeking it. He is seeking it. All his thought is bent on it. It is his great hope and our great fear. At the council call to determine what course of action to take, the wise elf Elrond explains that the ring cannot be wielded against the enemy because, as he says, it belongs to Sauron and was made by him alone and is altogether evil. And here Tolkien demonstrates his genius, his subtle insight into the nature of evil and the abuse of power that sets him apart from most other writers in his genre. Elrond says of the ring, "Its strength is too great for anyone to wield at will, save only those who already have a great power of their own. But for them, it holds an even deadlier peril. The very desire of it corrupts the heart. If any of the wise should with this ring overthrow the Lord of Mordor, using his own arts, he would then set himself up on Sauron's throne, and yet another Dark Lord would appear. And that is another reason why the ring should be destroyed. As long as it is in the world, it will be a danger even to the wise. For nothing is evil at the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. If anyone should try to vanquish evil using its own arts, Tolkien tells us, that person will succumb to the evil as well. We have seen it so often in our world. The idealistic revolutionary who rises up against oppression. Think Lenin, think Castro, think Mobutu. That person becomes an oppressor in turn upon gaining power. There is something about power when it is defined as force or domination that entices us, lures us, and then captures us in the net of evil. To try to use the One Ring to dominate is to be dominated oneself by its evil. To use the sword, even for supposedly good ends, is to be corrupted. Simone Weil put it this way: contact with force, from whichever the end the contact is made, sword point or sword handle, deprives one of God. Jesus himself weighed in on the subject when he said, those who take the sword will die by the sword. We live in a world that is fascinated with power and violence. We claim to abhor violence, of course, and we feign horror and dismay when it transgresses the boundaries of what we deem appropriate, as it did this week. But when it comes down to it, we depend on violence and power as domination, what feminist theologians call power over. In fact, we have difficulty conceiving of power in any other way than as force and coercion. We are a culture of idolaters, and power is our God. Walter Wink says that our culture is undergirded by what he calls the myth of redemptive violence, going all the way back to the creation stories of the ancient Near East, in which the world is formed from the carcass of the great dragon of chaos, defeated and killed by a warrior god. Wink says that much of human culture throughout history has been founded upon this largely unexamined myth that we could create order and peace through the exercise of violent, dominating power. This myth finds expression in thousands of ways, and its great danger lies not merely in the assumption that whatever good ends we seek can be attained through violent means, but that they can only be attained through violent means. But Wink and Tolkien and Weil and King and Gandhi, and before them all, Jesus, declare that violence and force can never achieve good ends. When we play by the devil's rules, using the devil's tools, our motives cease to matter. The devil has already won. The power of the ring turns us into another dark lord. The power of the sword cuts us who hold the hilt as surely as it cuts those we wield it against. When we look at our lectionary texts that are actually from the Bible today and compare them side by side with current events, we can see the consistent use and abuse of what I have called power over. In the story from 1 Samuel, the childless Hannah is tormented by Peninnah, the other wife of Elkanah. The mother of several children herself, Peninnah knows that Hannah's barrenness is a source of great shame to her, so she proceeds to provoke her severely to irritate her. Peninnah uses her power to provoke and demean her rival. When we look at the gospel lesson and its background, we see further evidences of power over. The Roman occupiers used their power to exact heavy tribute from the people of Palestine to support their wars, their building projects, and the lavish lifestyles of their elites. The priests and the aristocrats of the temple also abused the people. They levied taxes and tithes over and above the Roman tribute, often forcing the peasants into crushing debt so that they can gobble up their land, as we saw last week with the story of the widow's mite. They use religious language and symbolism to validate and sanctify their crimes, and it is largely because of these abuses that Jesus condemns the temple to destruction. The priests and temple aristocracy use their power to make themselves rich while impoverishing the people they are supposed to care for. Turning to events in our world, the one that occupies all of our minds this morning is, of course, Friday's attacks in Paris. The jihadists of Islamic State, or ISIS, who carried out the attacks, used their power to shoot up a concert hall, detonate explosives at the football stadium, and fire into crowds of people in sidewalk cafes in an effort to terrorize the people of France. It worked. Around 130 people are dead and 350 wounded, some critically. Those numbers may have gone up. I haven't seen the revised ones this morning. But the impact of the attacks goes far beyond those numbers. People all over the city of Paris, the nation of France, and the entire world are cowed by the possibility of meeting a violent end while simply going about the ordinary business of life. ISIS has had a busy couple of weeks of carnage. In addition to the Paris attacks, they claimed responsibility for suicide and roadside bombings in Beirut on Thursday and Baghdad on Friday, killing 69 and wounding more than 200, and for bringing down that Russian plane in Egypt 2 weeks ago, killing all 224 aboard. This group continues to demonstrate its propensity for using its power to kill, maim, and destroy. What troubles me are the reactions I keep hearing from leaders in Europe and the United States. French President Francois Hollande vowed to wage merciless war on ISIS, and he has closed France's borders. Polish leaders have said that their country will refuse to participate in the EU's plan to accept refugees from Syria unless Poland's security is guaranteed, as though that were possible. One suspects that many other European nations will follow suit. In our country, the presidential candidates have fallen all over themselves to express their outrage, talk tough, and lay blame. Governor Kasich has invoked NATO's Mutual Defense Clause to call for the U.S. to take military action and destroy ISIS. Other candidates have excoriated President Obama for not taking a strong enough stand against ISIS, and many observers that the U.S. will soon escalate its military involvement in Syria. So many voices are calling for us to use our power to exact revenge on our enemies and rid the world of the threat they pose. What these voices fail to acknowledge is that these problems are largely of our own making. The Islamic State group formed as people became radicalized after the United States' invasion and occupation of Iraq. We invaded Iraq to bring down Saddam Hussein, whom the U.S. had supported in the 1980s in their war against our big bad enemy, Iran. Before that, when our biggest, baddest enemy of all, the Soviet Union, invaded Afghanistan, we armed and trained the Mujahideen to fight them. That context helped give rise to both the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We have consistently used our power to combat the enemy of the moment without regard for the enemies we would create as a result. What enemy will arise as a result of our current fixation on ISIS? The sword will kill us, whether by blade or hilt, but we are addicted to the sword and don't see any alternatives. But Jesus does. When his disciples marvel at the mighty stones of the temple, the visual, concrete representation of power over in their midst, he says, don't place your trust in these things. Don't believe the myth. Don't believe it when the false prophets and messiahs come, claiming to represent God and demanding that you take up arms in God's name. Not one of these great stones that you marvel at will be left on one another. Not one of these idols in which you are tempted to place your trust will remain standing. All will be thrown down. Jesus knows that there is another power in the world that is ultimately stronger than power over. Feminist theology again gives us the terminology, power with. Instead of the domination of power over, power with promotes cooperation. Instead of using brute force, power with uses persuasion. Instead of violence, power with runs on compassion. Instead of defeating and dehumanizing the weak, power over shares with the weak and helps them discover their own power. In the so-called real world, of course, this doesn't look like power at all, but like weakness. The courage it takes not to fight looks to a world in love with fighting more like cowardice. The wisdom of power with looks to the world like utter folly. Returning to the Lord of the Rings, we find that the Council of Elrond has determined that the only possible course of action, since it is too hazardous to try to use the ring, is to destroy it. The problem is, since Sauron himself forged the ring, the only place where it can be unmade is at Mount Doom, within the very borders of the Dark Lord's own land of Mordor. At this prospect, some in the council falter. What strength have we to finding the fire in which the ring was made, one of them asks. That is the path of despair. I would say folly if the long wisdom of Elrond did not forbid me. Despair or folly, said Gandalf? It is not despair, for despair is only for those who see the end beyond all doubt. We do not. It is wisdom to recognize necessity when all other courses have been weighed, as though as folly it may appear to those who cling to false hope. Well, let folly be our cloak, a veil before the eyes of the enemy. For he is very wise, and he weighs all things to a nicety in the scales of his malice. But the only measure he knows is desire for power, and so he judges all hearts. Into his heart the thought will not enter that any will refuse it, that having the ring we may seek to destroy it. If we seek this, we shall put him out of reckoning. We know how the story plays out. The ring bearer, Frodo Baggins, to the eyes of the world the smallest and weakest hero imaginable, the least likely person to bear such an awful burden, does indeed take the ring into Mordor. Assisted by his loyal servant and faithful companion Sam, he makes his way to Mount Doom, and with the none too gentle help of the creature Gollum, manages to surrender the ring to the flames. The Dark Tower falls, the power of the Dark Lord is broken, and the three peoples of Middle-earth are saved. I guess I should have said spoiler alert. Sorry. The glory, the utter genius, and the ultimate truth of Tolkien's work is that it is not the mighty warriors or kings or wizards who win the day, but rather a pair of timid and fearful hobbits. And they do not prevail by force of arms, but through steadfastness, compassion, and keeping faith with their duty and with one another. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength, goes the Song of Hannah. But the strength of the feeble is not any strength the world recognizes. The strength of force and of domination, power over. It is a strength that looks like weakness. The strength that refuses to fight with the devil's weapons, even for supposedly godly ends. It is the power that lifts up instead of beating down. It is the power that gives of itself to empower the other. It is the power that the world cannot and never will understand. It is power with. It is the power of God. We are called